We had spoken last time about the different elements of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we have to believe in, the different aspects of it, and something about proofs. So let's just, recap one or 2 points, and then we will try to move towards the different contemplations, which I'd like to call them, of understanding HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or I don't know if the word proving, I hate to use this proving, but confirming the validity of Torah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, etc. Again, 1 or 2 caveats. One is to repeat what we said last time, that I don't think there is a concept of an absolute proof in anything more complex than math or simple science, and certainly not in things of this nature. So what we're talking though about is something which we'll call evidence instead of proof, and a confirmation and a belief rather than absolutely proven, etc. Which means that for it to be effective, you need to think a lot about it. For instance, if I prove to you 2 and 2 equals 4, and I check the equations, I add up a column of figures, that's instant. As long as I'm sure I didn't make any mistakes, it's there instantly, and there's no issue with that. When I try to convince you about that, let's say, communism is good or it's bad or things of that nature, then what I need to do is you need to think about it, to ponder it, and slowly your mind accepts or rejects it. And that's why in Inyanim V'Emunah, a contemplation or hisbonenus is the right approach. Argument on a piece of paper that you go through and quote-unquote checks out is not bringing emunah into you. Thinking about, contemplating, and the truth is it's true about all Musar actually, but specifically here it's the thinking about it. So 1 point is it's going to be hisbonenus. 2, a lot of times we take a shortcut and we say, oh, what a complex machine it is, must be a great builder built it, but when you do it shorthand, you get a semi-convincing type of argument. If you think about piece by piece, just like when you owe somebody a favor and tell the guy, thanks a lot, really was a great favor, that's one way of looking at it. When you say, you took time when you had pressure on yourself, and there was a lot of money, and it was annoying because you were under tension, and I really needed it. How much thought you give it and spell it out longhand makes a lot of times a difference, and that's why summing it up in 3 or 4 words is not going to give you the truth inherent in it. It's not going to have the effect it should have if a person thinks about it. So a lot of these points about emunah, a lot of these contemplations require hisbonenus, to sit, to think, to ponder. Maybe they're not right also. Maybe you come to a different conclusion. But it's not the type of thing where you can add up on a calculator and double check it and that's the end of that. That's one thing that I feel a need to repeat. The second thing is vis-a-vis myself as a Rav figure versus scientist. We're going to obviously come head to head on with scientific community. And there are 2 approaches when people come and look at things vis-a-vis scientists and so on. There is a type of approach that says, they know nothing, which I think comes from a vantage point of weakness. When people don't want to confront the argument, just sweep away, what do they know? They know nothing. Torah is so much more important, etc., etc., given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Who are they with all their arguments? The problem with that is that it's not genuine, because when a person has any physical problem, he looks for doctors, and very few people go to very, very, very special doctors, and they look for the very best doctor who, if he doesn't know anything, Why is it that they rely on him to open up their hearts, to fool around a few hours in their heart, sew it back together again? People use computers and depend on it for their businesses without saying they don't know anything. There's something disingenuous about somebody living in the modern world with tremendous admiration for what we have, and in one area saying they know nothing. That is one extreme that I think is simply dishonest. And it comes from a sense of it comes from a sense of weakness. So the easiest way is to withdraw kind of in your shell and to say, who are they and what do they know? The other side, and again, I'm not trying to say that one ought to study their arguments and so on, but once a person is in a situation where he's confronted with it, the type of thing of, well, the Torah is given HaKadosh Baruch Hu right, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is infinite right, and he knows he's the source of Chachma right, and they know nothing right, so therefore there's nothing to talk about. I just don't find that a very honest standpoint. The flip side is that the day somebody wears a white gown and he is Dr. So-and-so, then gospel truth comes from his mouth. That's a very naive understanding about science, scientific process. The word science has taken on a much broader meaning than it's justified. I once read a very fascinating tidbit from Kissinger, the great diplomat, that he once was speaking to Adenauer, who was the German chancellor after World War II, and he was making a point that he'd heard it himself from a very high-ranking general in the Pentagon. And Adenauer asked him, Henry, did you hear it from him when he was wearing his uniform or when he was in civilian clothing? He said he was wearing his uniform, full uniform. He said, okay, go back to meet him when he's not wearing his uniform over dinner or something and talk to him and tell me if you still think that you're convinced by his argument. We have a way of sweeping things. For instance, in Gaza, they have people who are murderers and terrorists and happen to be medical doctors. And when they write a newspaper article sympathetic to the Hamas, they'll say, well, this person, he's not at all a terrorist type of person. He's a medical doctor who specialized in surgery, as if that would make a mensch out of him, or it would say that in politics he has the same smarts, wisdom, or whatever that he has in medicine. Many times you'll speak to a doctor who's very competent in his field, and medically and in other areas in politics he might be very flat and quite stupid. It's not a contradiction. People have areas of expertise, different areas of discipline have different required talents and so on, and therefore the broad sweep of science with a big capital S is also misleading. But let's be a little more specific. Let's talk about somebody who's an expert in his field. Let's give an example. Somebody's on trial for murder, and they found a little blood on the body of the murdered person that's not his. And it's a tiny speck, and they give it to a scientist, and the scientist labors on it really hard, manages to get out a piece of DNA, and matches it conclusively with the DNA of the suspect. At that point, the scientist testifies, and he will say the following: DNA on this body, the blood on this body contains DNA, which I have matched 100% with the DNA of this person. The chances of there being another person with the same DNA is 1 in 3 billion, and that's it. At that point, the scientist is really telling us science, the truth, and so on. If the scientist says, and therefore it's conclusively proven that he's the murderer, he is making a tremendous leap that is not he's going to be using his standing as a DNA scientist to reach a conclusion that is not science in the same sense. It's not necessarily warranted, and he may not be the best person to give it. There's a reason why there's a judge sitting there who supposedly is somebody with the wisdom to weigh different sides. He will take into account the scientist's fact as he's presented them, that DNA of X was found on this person's body. He will also hear other testimonies about a possible motive he may or may not have had, about the possibility that he may have hugged him with a bleeding finger and to say goodbye, and that's where the blood's there. There are many other things to consider. We have facts, we have the conclusions, and they're not one and the same. In real science, I would say there are actually 3 levels of things that we have to deal with. There are facts. Those are things that are clearly visible. Let's use that word visible. Our senses clearly detect it. For instance, we can take water and we can pour it out from a cup. Water is a fluid. That is something that we see, and that is something that science reports. It acts as a fact-gathering profession, and those are things that, barring mistakes or deliberate mistakes, we need to accept. So, for instance, if scientists say we found bones of the following size in X amount of places, unless if it's common enough and broad enough, we'll accept it as a fact. These bones are sizes bigger than any animal bones that we have. If we trust it, I think that falls under facts. There's an X amount of carbon in proportion to uranium. Those are facts. Those are all things that fall on the realm of fact, and in that it is in its best element. We'll assume also that the fact gathering has been going on for a long time, extensive, and done as honestly as possible. There's a second level where now you need to make some sort of rules, some sort of hypotheses about these facts together. Until this point, we're really talking about technicians, and now we need to start talking about some sort of theory. So, for instance, chemical theories are validated when they can be repeated. So if someone tells me to take oxygen and hydrogen, introduce electricity, and I get water out of it, if I can do it and it works every time, that is also a fact. So therefore, or it's not, I would say I need to accept it. It's something where it is true in the present, and I can keep doing it and repeating it, so that if somebody says if you put water on iron for X amount of time, it's going to rust, it's something that I can repeat and repeat, and that also, those type of hypotheses fall under fact. There are hypotheses about how things work, formulas for the strength of the attraction of two bodies to each other. That works in an incredible amount of different places, and again, that falls under things which I would feel very comfortable to take the scientist's point of view. Now, there's a third area, which is something that you don't see and you can't repeat. For instance, what happened 500 years ago in this spot? We come to a colony that was for some reason people were never heard of again, an abandoned colony. What happened? Now, science will turn up facts. They will find, let's say, all sorts of bacteria. They'll find arrows with blood on them, etc., etc. There will be some limited hypotheses that these arrows could only have come from the wood in a certain place. Therefore, people bearing it might have come from someplace else, and so on. But then there's a more sweeping hypothesis, which is, and therefore, Indians from a different place, from X place, came and destroyed this colony, and so on and so forth. That conclusion doesn't fall under the same heading of science as the conclusions about water rusting iron, etc. It's evidence and not proof, and it is a reasonable conclusion, but not a scientific theory, or a proven, so to speak, a theory in the sense of a proven, repeatable type of thing. And on that point, a historian might actually be much better judge than a scientist. He might say, well, but in the context of what we know about different peoples in those days invading other places, they never did go very far and invade. It wasn't the type of thing they normally did. So this would be extremely rare, and maybe it makes a lot more sense that somehow they bought arrows there, and arrows got sold along the coast until it reached this place, or something like that. So we have, now when the scientist comes along and tells us it is incontrovertible fact that they were destroyed by the following tribe, they're mixing and blurring two areas. One is a tight discipline where science deserves a certain deferring to, and conclusions, just like the expert testifying on DNA may be a lousy judge because he can't bring all the factors in. He's looking for very specific points, and once he has them in, but he doesn't look at a bigger picture about motive for the murder, possibility of the murder, other suspects, etc. Same thing here also. What happened X amount of years ago is not something that science can tell us unless they find a video. They find a video of creation and evolution, etc., and they show the video. If it's a true video, then that's it. That would fall in the category of that. But what we do is we look around, we find evidence, and we draw a picture from the evidence. So the evidence is something we need to accept as fact. The conclusions need to be thought about, and we need somehow to strip away a little bit of the extraordinary deferring that we'll do to a scientist when he's in first mode as opposed to second mode. Yes, Pinchas.
So Rebbe mentioned that there are certain phenomena which we will basically assume are facts, such as you take hydrogen and oxygen and add some electricity that creates water. Rebbe also mentioned the existence of certain carbon particles. So if scientists have a theory that carbon degenerates at a certain rate, then wouldn't it be within the umbrella of a fact when they date things using carbon?
Okay, so the Pinchas is raising the issue of, would carbon dating not be a fact under the same rubric that we've given? The answer is, there are certain assumptions made by it, which are not they're not illogical, but they're certainly not proven. For instance, what was the volume of, what was the ratio of carbon, of different isotopes of carbon to start with? Well, logic says, logic meaning if we assume nothing else, well, why would it be different? The rate that it's integrated, would we say physical phenomena changed? And so on. I will deal with it a little bit more when we get to it, but more as introduction is the point. We're going to have to separate in the arguments of scientists what are the facts on the ground and what has been drawn as a conclusion from it. And that's going to be a very, very important point, because when you come with the full weight of science and use it for the things that are, when you take the, Das Science on the node of Das Torah, if you take Das Science and you impose it where it doesn't belong, we can look at it logically without feeling coward that we're combating facts over here. So one area is the way in which we're going to have to look at what science and scientists have to say. There's another point that I think it's important to bear in mind. I don't mean it to sound as a criticism of other people speaking about this, but almost nobody speaking about these in Yonah Emunah is a scientist or a biologist. Even if he were, there is biology and there's paleontology and there is embryology. Science has become huge, and somebody who presents himself as know-it-all, expert-all, and he knows better than everybody else, there's something about it that is not, it's hubris a little bit, and it's not true. On the other hand, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us brains that we need to make decisions on. Let me give a mashal. When we need to have a medical decision, an important medical decision that is a matter of life or death. Somebody has cancer, and we need to make a decision about what course of treatment. So somebody barges in and tells the doctor, I read up on it on the internet, and I think we're going to do this and this. He's an idiot. Because in one evening's readings, you don't get somebody who's been working all his life in it, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, the doctor's not God. Doctors are human, they make mistakes, and they sometimes can overlook things, cannot make a correct evaluation in terms of what's right and so on. It's tough. You need to sit down and you talk to 2 or 3 doctors, and you need to sit back and think and say, maybe because this person is a radiologist, he's pushing radiology so much because that's really his expertise, but he's not taking surgery into account. And maybe the surgeon is not taking into account my father's emotional well-being, and he couldn't take surgery. He would just kind of he would depress out, and that would be the end of it. It's an important balance between understanding that at the end of the day we're responsible for ourselves. At the end of the day, doctors are not and scientists are not supermen. On the other hand, to the correct amount of modesty, knowing where you belong, where you don't belong. I read, and by no means in any way can I say that I've done it in a very professional way. I can only take and try to distill as an intelligent reader and present points that I think are very worthy of consideration. I take into account that I don't know an awful lot. On the other hand, I will not be cowed by somebody who's Dr. So-and-so if I don't really think that his argument at the bottom line is murderous. If I'm talking about somebody developing how the world's developed and how life is developed, and at some point he tells me, oh, this is very, very complex and the non-science won't understand it, I will not buy it. I need to have a general sketch of it and will consider it. Now, those are 2 general introductions about approaching these topics, because these topics inevitably are going to be part of a clash between scientists and science as today it is known, and we need to bear in mind the correct attitude. It is sheer hubris for someone as intelligent as it might be who read a few books to pose as an expert. You wouldn't want somebody who read a few Sfarim to pose as an expert, as a Talmid Chacham. You don't have the expert. On the other hand, you're making a decision about emunah. You're making a decision about what's right and wrong. And if you have a growing sense that they're not doing it, then you, by all rights, have to say, you've got to convince me, because I'm not going to take trust us. We know what's right. If we don't have Emunah's Chachamim, I think we certainly can be a little bit cynical about Emunah's scientists. We can deal with facts, but the Emunah scientists, I think we can kind of dampen down a bit. So those are 2 introductions. Let's go back to the point we're trying to. What are the types of contemplations that will bring a person to confirm and reaffirm and make Emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu very strong? The first argument we spoke about was Yesh Me'ayin. And this is something which science cannot deal with in any way. There's a famous theorem, Gödel's theorem, about no system can prove itself from inside. And it's the elementary point of logical thought is everything has a cause. And that would make the world's existence an impossibility. Where did the world come from? And Aristotle, the Rambam brings belief in Kadmus Olam, which meant the world is eternal. That is something which, whether it's right or wrong, but it is an unscientific, illogical statement. We have to admit logic does not, in its furthest reach, ever explain existence. I want to add something. When we speak about existence, we kind of think of a little murky, soup. A little hydrogen atom, a little nebulous hydrogen atom that became something really big, that grew up to become the world. I want to say something. Every single piece of matter in the world has a whole book of rules that it works by. All of physics is the rules built into basic matter, whether it's electromagnetic interaction, whether it's different forces in the atom, how they work and everything. The rules, they work by real rules. It's not like we imagine kind of the first matter being a little nothingness, a little mud, which is not really very important. That's kind of, so we can kind of say, well, maybe that existed. Somehow we fantasize it. The laws of physics are immutable. No one has ever broken those laws and got away with it. Zilch. I mean, sometimes we find out that something is a special case of a larger rule, but no rules are broken. Everything comes very clearly defined. We have not only things in the world, but we have an impeccably sharp system of how things are defined. Their ability to move, their ability to be contracted, their ability to repulse, the energy, all of these things are the stuff of physics. Big books full of rules that are observations of the rules written into nature. Where those rules came from, who enforces them, how did something like that come into place? And when you start yourself and say, well, it's just been that way, I think it's shirking the question. It's the same way the secular person accuses the religious person of not consulting difficult questions. We turn around and say to them, you yourself must admit that human mind, the world is bigger than human mind, and human mind falls short of it. That's the first hisbonus, and hisbonus of Bereshis. And again, these things are not just 1, 2, 3 arguments. Think about it. Walk and think about it. And there is not even a theory to explain that, because there can't be a theory to explain that. I mean, the theory only keeps taking you back another step. And like we said last time, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not a way out simply. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says the emes of the world exists outside of the world, beyond the world, in a way that is past human imagination. That is the first bonus, and a very, very important bonus. The second one is life itself. And this is obviously the area where we're going to come head to head against the scientists, so to speak, or head to head confront science. Let's first ask ourselves, why won't a scientist believe in God, etc.? And again, I'm talking about not the scientist as a human being, but science as such. There are two answers, there are two reasons. And one reason was, especially Christianity had given a worldview that included explanations of science incorporated into religion, or the other way around. The Catholic Church had its theories about the world and the nature of the world in a way that that incorporated the religion into it, and the scientific beliefs of the world were considered part of the church's firm beliefs. And any kfira in the way the church saw the world was kfira in the religion. So what happened was, as people discovered that they were absolutely wrong about things in the world, about the nature of nature was not the way they saw it, they dumped everything with it. Or, let's put it in more specific terms, when they began to question creation the way it's written in the Torah, so then that whole thing became seen as quote-unquote myth, fiction, and to be disregarded. So the first reason why science will not consider God has historical background, because science was on a confrontational track with religion, vis-a-vis religious view of the way nature works and so on. Everything became dumped with it. The second reason, which is an honest reason, is science can only deal with things that science can deal with. For instance, a fork can be used to eat meat and fish and potatoes. It's very hard to eat soup with a fork. And it's a tool, and it's a tool that works well with certain things. Science can only work with things that are observable, quantifiable, repeatable. Those are some of the things that science needs to work with, and refutable. So, if I tell you I see 2 atoms and you say see 3 atoms, that's a scientific issue because we can see it, we can test for it, we can see reactions. We can build theories that are that fit within the realm of logic. That the attraction between this and this is given by this formula, and it can be broken this way, and so on and so forth. Those are scientific topics. God, if I tell you, let's forget a minute. Let's take angels. If I tell you angels can never be observed by any physical senses, and we can't put any rules on their behavior, then science is no longer a tool that can deal with it. Science, it's not that science believes or disbelieves in angels. If you describe angels that way, then science is simply not going to be able to deal with it. It's not a tool for it. It's a fork for a soup, and it's just not going to work. However, science, honest science says, listen, we can't speak about God as creator. That's not a scientific type of matter. Even without God. But the minute I say the answer lies outside the system of logic and materia as we know it, then science says that no longer is the discipline of science. Just like a psychiatrist will need to look at a patient and ask himself, is this problem chemical? And then the MD of myself is the one that's going to deal with it, and I will give him medicine X to take care of whatever it is. Or are his problems in the mind and not in the brain, and then the psychologist of me is going to deal with it. Those are, so science has a natural limitation. Science can deal only with observable, quantifiable, logical, repeatable phenomena. So an honest scientist will say the reason why I can't consider God within the realm of science. God is not a scientific in the sense that it can be quantifiable. However, so basically, if we were to be very honest, we would start a book on evolution with the following words. If one were to take the possibility of God or the divine out of the picture, what would be the way we could explain the world? And then we would have to do X, Y, or Z. Let's give an example. Let's give an analogy. Let's say somebody is, a detective is told to work on a case, a murder case. And he's told, you are to solve the murder case. One caveat, Jack cannot be the suspect. Now, sometimes the reason for that is because Jack is in jail and he's chained down and there's no way he could have done it. So even though he's a very wonderful suspect, he had a reason to kill him and he's a murderer, well, we have to take him out. That's fine. Let's say Jack is believed to be, by me, believed to be such an honest person that he's on suspicion. Just like if a person finds himself accused unjustly and they have evidence against him, no matter how strong the evidence is, he knows he didn't do it. So he's going to take himself out of the picture. And sometimes it's because Jack is a very close friend of the guy giving him the assignment, and he doesn't want Jack accused. He tells him the only one that can be accused is Jack, which then might wreak havoc with the investigation. Evolution is the scientific study of the world if we take out anything out of nature. The word supernatural is not mystical. It means anything beyond the pale of nature if we take that out. So, that means that you're already limiting yourself to all suspects except for Jack. You're not even looking for the truth with a capital T. You're saying, solve it this. It's like sometimes you get a puzzle and you say, using only this or that, solve for it. It's not the best solution always. It's sometimes not even a viable solution, but that's what we have. And it's very important to bear that in mind, that science it's a priori limited. I will be reading to you soon, probably next time, where you get a scientist comes up with the following type of argument. He'll say, this becomes so tempting to give in and just say that it must be God. And you ask yourself, well, I don't understand. As an honest scientist, why don't you say it's so staggering impossible that God is the conclusion? And no, he writes with pride about how the Yetzer Hara of Emunah tempted him, and thank God, or I don't know, thank nature, he stuck his guns. I mean, that's the literally. And it's an attitude that what happened is when from becoming that of how can we understand the argument without God, it also ran as an argument, and this is a point that we need to a distinction we need to make. When we will be talking about evolution, etc., there are two aspects to the argument of it. One is that to understand the world, we need not to recourse to anything beyond nature. That's one argument of evolution, and that argument of evolution is one needs to do it one way. The second argument of evolution is that it raises problems with the way the Torah seems to describe creation of the world. And in a certain sense, that's a much stronger issue. It's an issue which we need to answer. On the first one, on the issue of evolution as a substitute, when people came and said, you must believe in God because X, Y, and Z. When you say you must believe, so as long as I have 1 in a trillion way of explaining, not like that, it's not a proof. If I can prove everything it's true in every case except for one case, it's not a proof. So when people made the argument it must be that God, so when you need to have absolute impossibility, you find very quickly that there is no such thing as absolute impossibility. But when you ask yourself, really, why are you going out on a limb on something so far-fetched? Person is, do you honestly think that you must find something so far-fetched? Why is it that you don't want to reach the much more obvious conclusion? Then it becomes a much more powerful point. The other issue, and now we'll have to deal with as we go along, is it does pose, there are facts that pose problems with the way we read certain parts of the Torah. And then it becomes a question on our full view, not on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but on Torah. Yes, Pinchas.
So, just back to the earlier point
yes.
that Rabbi made. Basically, is what Rabbi's saying that when science comes and tries to solve, tries to understand the world as they see it, there's really no difference. There's no sphere to Emunah. It's just that scientists are not going to call it God. They're just going to call it, the force of gravity, electromagnetic force. Whereas we could say, yeah, that's God.
Well, it's the question is deeper. Pinchas is asking if we cannot. On which the terminology. The big difference is as follows. The force of gravity is totally quantifiable. The idea that gravity could come from no place, that gravity is beyond understanding, doesn't exist. That the root of things are beyond understanding, that's one area, and it will lead to a second point about whether there is what we called in one of our last shurim, will or not. In other words, the Kuzari makes this point about Aristotle's God, that it's a dry scientific construct, not different than any other law in physics. The law of gravity does not want me to come closer to the ground. It does not. There is no will or tachlis or ratzon, anything like that. It's just the mechanics. So we're going two steps ahead. We're establishing a realm of the beyond nature, and that realm includes a component of will, tachlis, and we'll see later the more important moral dimension, which I guess would be aligned with that. So we're going to need to deal with, the first thing is looking at the evolutionary issue vis-a-vis HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In other words, trying to ask ourselves, looking at the theory of evolution and its limitations, how does it stand up in terms of reasonableness vis-a-vis our understanding of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? How improbable is it? Once again, I am not claiming to be an expert. I have points. I've read about it, and I want to make points I think every intelligent man can consider. If some of those points, I do believe that in the scope, these points would hold water no matter how you explain it. If not, then we'll have to redo it. I think the one thing we need to bear in mind with Yishurim are, this is not finality. It's not as if I can say I got this halacha from Sinai. These are points of thinking, and when somebody comes along and points out weaknesses, you rethink it, and so on. You don't throw away a theory that's built on a lot of elements with a lot of thought with one question. I have a cousin who's a physicist, and he was once explaining to myself, my brother, about certain current theories, and then pointing out the weaknesses. And my brother asked him, so why don't you discard the theory? And he said, something that's worked a few thousand times in different situations, you don't throw away on one question or two questions. You say, look at yourself, maybe there's something wrong about how it came to be a question on the theory. Maybe it's a special case. We're talking about big things. We're talking about sweeping understandings, and we're just going to try to give ourselves a framework for thinking into it and understanding in the big picture where the real inherent issues are with evolution and its limitations. But we're going to be talking about it not in terms of the problem with the Torah's chronology versus evolutionary chronology, but rather in terms of a solution to life as coming on its own without any outside cause. And Mitzvah Hashem, I will try to use some original material, some source material, and talk about it. Yes?
Perhaps we could sum up by mentioning the contemplations that he said earlier in this year.
Okay, so going back again, the contemplations that we're going to be looking at are, the first thing would be the idea of where things come from, period, where existence originates. A second point is going to be the complexity of the world and life especially, in a way that it's not reducible, in a way that it would seem almost improbable beyond anything possible. And again, I'm not using the word impossible, but improbable beyond anything any reasonable person would consider. We're going to look at the moral dimension of a human, and we're going to look at history and possible personal contemplations. Those are going to be the 4 or 5 types of contemplations that will base a person's emunah. Each one has its own reinforcing mechanism. Each one contributes something to our belief and understanding. Just like we'll use the example of a marriage bond. A marriage bond is built on the goodness you associate with the other person, the loyalty, the intelligence, the attraction, many things. A good bond reinforces itself in many different ways. Good emunah reinforces itself in many different angles. And I think these 4 or 5 contemplations are the major ones, and we will go in order. Okay.